Once you're further along in an opportunity, whether it's a school district, a school, a nonprofit organization, or any other organization, you really need to figure out what the procurement process is. And I think a good time to find that out is, once someone tells you that they want a proposal from you and you provide a proposal, a next good step is to really understand the procurement process. And in a school district or working with a school district or a government agency, there's some unique attributes to it. One is you have to know what the threshold is for an RFP and for a board approved contract, right? And so many districts have different thresholds. A common one is $50,000, but you should check with the school system that you're working with what that threshold is. And if you can imagine, if they have to go through an RFP process because you're offering something that's $100,000, then that's going to elongate the sales process, but also it's going to put some risk in the deal because the RFP process is a competitive bid process. Another thing that you really need to figure out, even if it's a small deal, is how many signatures are required to get this deal done or the contract signed, who needs to sign off on the contract, and also what funds are being used. Because I've had experiences where for a small contract, I've had to get 7 signatures, and just getting 7 signatures and the explanation that's required by your kind of contact person or your champion to get all of those 7 signatures just takes time, right? It's just not going to happen in one day. And that could drag out for weeks or even a month. And then also knowing specifically what funds are being used and what budget year those funds are, because you may assume that a project might start in the spring, but they're using funds that won't be released to fall. So while you sign your contract in the spring, you might not actually be able to start your work because it's not a funded project until the fall. So those are ways to be aware of, things to be aware of, so that you're not surprised by either the delays in implementation or signing the contract. Another thing to be aware of is what's required to become a registered vendor in a school district. And even your contact might not know all the details. What you need to do is find out from the procurement office what's required to become a vendor within the school system, and really what they need in order for them to issue a PO. And that includes everything like fully executed contract, a legal entity, a certificate of good standing from the state, insurance requirements, state registrations, background checks. There's a whole list that every district may have that is required for every vendor that they work with. And so you just need to understand what those are. Sometimes also, I just want to make sure you're aware, they may have some requirements. If it doesn't make sense for you to do those things, it's okay for you to reach back out to your contact or the procurement office to make sure that to see if you can get some of those things waived. That's not a problem. You don't have to take every single checklist item for grant as something that's required, but you could, it's some of the minimum that they're asking for. And if there are some questions, you could push back on those things as well. So knowing all these things will really set your expectations as to when a contract may realistically get signed. You won't get as frustrated with some of the delays, but you'll also have a better sense of when the work can actually get started, and you could actually start billing for that work, because you can't really start billing for that work until you start delivering some of the work. So I hope these things help you create kind of more predictability in your finances and your revenue and the work that you're going to be doing. Here are 6 tips that you should know about every deal and every customer that you work with so that you don't have delays in executing your contract and delays in implementation and ultimately delays in making an impact. So the first is knowing the difference between customer and buyer. For example, if you're selling a literacy product and or service and you're working with the executive director of literacy at a school district, that person is maybe your end customer because you're providing a PD solution, but the buyer might be the chief academic officer, the person making the approval decision and allocating the budget, right? So the customer and user might be different than the buyer. You just need to understand both, and you need to know both people because it's very well possible that the buyer, in this case, the CAO, might have other priorities and you just don't know about it, or they may want to reduce the scope of your project. And if you don't know who the buyer is, then that could blindside you. The second is just possible delays in decision making, right? Like the person that you're working with is ready to go. They're fully not familiar with the procurement process of the school district. So you really need to work with them in figuring out what are the possible decision-making delays. Some of it may be the requirement of multiple signatures. Some of it might be you have to wait for it to get on the agenda of the next board meeting. All these things are possible delays, and these are delays that could last 30 days to 60 days or 90 days in some cases. Knowing the funding source is essential for the reliability and the predictability of when this project will start. Are you using funds from this school year or next school year is a critical factor in understanding when the work might actually get started. Finally, there are compliance issues that you might have to deal with. Knowing what are the registration requirements as a vendor, you might have to provide state forms to show that you're an entity, show that you're in good standing. The district might have insurance requirements like liability, workers' comp, auto insurance. They may also have you sign certain affidavits that need to be notarized. These are all things that take a lot of time to put together and get done and then submit. And so you want to make sure you understand what those are so that you could do those simultaneously. And then finally, the last two, intellectual property. If you're developing work and you have a work product or methodology, or you have a product that you're selling and you want to retain that intellectual property, you have to understand various intellectual property laws. The district might have their own contract language that they're used to. They'll certainly have some language around student data and privacy. But if you're hired as an independent contractor, they might consider you hired as work for hire, and they might try to own some of the intellectual property. So there's things that you need to put in place, like prior methodology, derivative works, royalty-free licensing, all these things that might come into play as you think about who owns the intellectual property. And then finally, I think you want to right size the process with the contract value. Sometimes you can't help it, like in large school systems, you got to follow their process, and they may have a standard contract for independent contractors that you have to stick with, or it's going to be an extended negotiation because you'll work with their attorneys. If you're a larger company, you might be able to negotiate your agreement. But for smaller organizations, a lot of times you're ending up having to accept their agreement if they're substantially bigger than you. Some of the independent schools and nonprofits may not have as complicated of a process, but also, you don't want to have this really complicated agreement for a $3,000 project. You also don't, if it's a $300,000 project, that might be okay. So you want to negotiate or right size the process of the contract with the value of the contract.